Dobry večer, good morning, good afternoon. Would you like to move over here a little bit? This way I can talk to you and not 2 chairs far away. Ladies and gentlemen at the back, if you'd like to stay, please do. If you'd like to talk, please leave. Thank you for being here on this festival day. I know it's festival in Moscow, and I think there are better things to do than listen to a lecture on a festival day. A lecture is not exactly festive, but at least I will try to keep you awake this afternoon and talk about some important issues that affect all of us. How many people here are actually from Moscow or from Russia? Great, okay, nice, good. And it's nice to be talking to colleagues and friends from Russia as well. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll take that one too. Thank you very much. That's a good idea. Maybe we'll do this TED style, a little more like TED, so we're out here and I can see you and you can see me as well. I was first in Moscow. Anyone want to guess when I was first in Moscow? Does you know, sir? Which day is that? 75. I know people think, oh, it must be after the fall of the Soviet Union. I was here 3 times during that period when Brezhnev and others were here, and I've been several times since then. So as you can imagine, I have seen a lot of change here. But I said, who was here yesterday to listen to the mayor? Raise your hand if you were here yesterday. So some of you, but not too many, because I said yesterday to the mayor that while things have changed, of course, a lot, new buildings, a lot of cars, a lot of traffic, a lot more money, Moscow, like many cities, does not really change that much in its soul, in its core. And I pointed out that the free Moscow of today is not so different than the unfree Moscow under the Soviet Union. And Moscow under the Soviet Union is not so different from Moscow under the Tsars. And when the Germans were at the gates of Moscow in World War II, it's not so different when Napoleon was at the gates of Moscow more than 75 years ago. Because cities are the essential communities of our world, and they don't change that much. They are today, in their essence, what they have been. The places where we're born. Who was born in Moscow? So if somebody says, where are you born? You don't say Russia, or you say Moscow. I was born in New York. I don't say I was born in the United States. I say I was born in New York. We grow up, we go to school, we get married. We play, we work, we pray. We get sick, we get old, and we die in the cities that define us. You see, it's hard to say, I was born in Russia, because were you born in the Russian Federation? Were you born in the Soviet Union? Were you born in Tsarist Russia? We can't even, that changes. But for 1,000 years, if you were born in Moscow, you were born in Moscow. And it says who you are. So the city is something very, very special in our world. And what I want to suggest to you today is that the city needs to play a much larger role in governance than it does. Because here are some facts about cities. A couple of years ago, the United Nations announced that over half of the world's population lives in cities. And if you look at the population of Europe and Japan and North America, it's 75% of the population live in cities. The wealth of the world, over 80% of the wealth of the world is produced in cities. Patents, new inventions, people have been talking about technology. 95% of patents are taken out in cities. Cities is where there's invention, creativity, innovation. The previous session here was about universities, research institutions. You will find them almost completely in cities. Every great city has at least one, in many cases, several great universities and research institutions. When I was here in 1975, even in the Soviet time, Moscow State University was already a great and important university. I actually stayed in the rooms of Moscow State University when I was here. It was a great university. The rooms weren't so great. So cities are very, very special. But we live in a world where cities are not significant as governing institutions. We don't take them seriously. Anyone who studies political science or international relations, look at that term, international relations, studies the nation state. And today, if you're interested in politics here, you say, what's happening in the Russian Federation? What is Putin doing? What is Medvedev doing? People don't worry so much about what the mayors are doing. Recently, President Obama met with President Xi of China to talk about a possible climate deal. When we think about climate change, we talk about nation states. And for 400 years, in fact, the nation state has been the central focus of our politics. And for a good reason. The city is much older than the nation state. I said Moscow is older than Russia, Boston is older than the United States, London is older than England, Damascus is older than Syria, Cairo is older than Egypt. But we talk about Egypt and France and England more than we talk about the cities, because in the old world, the city was too small to deal with the new problems of the 15th and 16th and 17th century. And the idea of the nation state, a state organized around great Russians, around Georgians, around Poles, around Germans, the Japanese people, the French people, the Italian people, we organized our states around these large nationalities, living in large territories that included many cities. And for the last 400 years, whenever we think about almost anything, the economy, immigration, climate, we think about the nation state. And I think if you think about America as a political person, you say, what about Obama? What about Obama and Putin? What is the relationship between Russia and the United States, between Russia and China, between Russia and Japan? And that was appropriate, because all of the things, even when I was a young man growing up, a child growing up, most of the things that happened in America were American. When I was little, 4 or 5 years old, 7 years old, I lived in Manhattan in New York, and my mother said, don't go to Brooklyn, there's a virus there, you'll get sick. Stay in Manhattan, don't cross the river. Today, I don't worry about the viruses of Brooklyn. I worry about Ebola, West Nile virus, Mexican pig flu. and of course HIV, the new global pandemics that affect every country all at once around the world. My first car, my first automobile, Machina, was a Chevrolet, a good American car. Today, I still want to drive an American car, so I drive a BMW. You know why? Because my BMW is made in South Carolina from American parts, and Chevrolet is made in Mexico with 70% foreign parts. Chevrolet is not an American car, it's a global car. BMW is not a German car, it's a global car. We live in a global economy. Here in Moscow, I don't think anyone worries about Moscow warming, certainly not this week, but not ever, because there is no problem of Moscow warming or Russian warming or Asian warming. It's a problem of global warming, global sea rise. Climate change is a global problem. So for the last 400 years, we have had a political institution that in effect deals inside borders with all the problems we're supposed to have to deal with, when the problems increasingly have become interdependent and transnational. Take labor migration. People move now around the world looking for jobs. They come from sub-Saharan Africa into Morocco, and from Morocco to Spain, and from Spain into Europe. They come from Guatemala to Mexico, from Mexico to the United States looking for jobs. And they don't stop at the political borders, because the political borders are completely irrelevant to the economic borders of a global economy. So they go where the jobs are. And that creates this problem all over the world of so-called illegal immigrants, people who are there without a proper visa, but who are there by the logic of global economics for good reasons, because there's work, because there's a job. So we live in a world in the 21st century of interdependent global challenges, and we still respond to them with 18th century bordered, independent nation states. So there is an asymmetry between the problems and the challenges, which are interdependent, and the political answers that are still based on bordered, independent nation states. And in that problem lies the increasing failure of the world to be able to address the real challenges it faces, whether it's immigration or climate change or a global economy or even terrorism. Think about war. War just 75 years ago was the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, against fascist Italy, against England and America. Nation states had armies and navies and air forces. But today our enemies are not other nations, but small terrorist groups, often without borders. Al-Qaeda is an interdependent global terrorist group. It's not Syrian, it's not Iraqi, it's not Yemeni. It knows no address. It's global. The old armies, the old weaponry is no good. America makes B-1 bombers, one of the most powerful bombers in the world, that cost $80 million to make. But you can't use a B-1 bomber against a suicide bomber. The suicide bomber is more powerful. And the suicide bomber is a global phenomenon for which states have no answer. Not in Moscow, not in New York, not in Tokyo, not in Madrid. So here's the problem. A world of global challenges which is responded to by the politics of nation states. And no wonder that increasingly we see a failure of states to actually answer and respond to those challenges. For 22 years, the nations of the world, since the Rio Conference, have been meeting every year to talk about climate change. And you remember they had a Kyoto Protocol that few nations signed and even fewer followed. But in 22 years, every year, carbon emissions, greenhouse emissions go up, and the nations meet and explain why they cannot act. They cannot do anything because their sovereignty, their independence, and their borders do not permit them to act together. So what do we do if we have a world of interdependent problems and a world of independent states that increasingly fail and cannot deal with those problems? Well, my suggestion is that we change the subject. Stop talking about states, failed states, inefficient states, gridlocked states, and start talking about cities. Stop talking about prime ministers and presidents, about Putin and David Cameron and François Hollande and Merkel, President Xi, and start talking about mayors. The mayors who actually run cities and make cities work. Stop talking about the citizens of states who are passive spectators to a politics they watch on television, and start talking about the active, engaged citizens of a local neighborhood, of a district, of Moscow, Smolensk, or St. Petersburg. We have to change the subject and begin to think about how can we empower cities to do the hard work of governance in the 21st century when states have failed to do that. And in my book, If Mayors Ruled the World, I try to think about what it would mean for cities to be empowered more to actually govern, not just one by one, but to govern together. To do the work that the United Nations can't do, because the United Nations is, in fact, the disunited nations. It is an organization that cannot work. It is an organization because it is based on sovereign, rival, sometimes warring states cannot work. The last time the United Nations intervened effectively in the war was in the Korean War, 65 years ago, and it only did that because the Soviet Union was not exercising its veto at the time. It wasn't there. If the Soviet Union had been at the table, the Korean War also would not be a UN war. Since that time, every war has been a war that has been fought not by the United Nations in the name of peace and justice, but by individual countries seeking their own interests, whether it's American interests or Chinese or Russian interests or other interests. So how do we fashion from cities, the oldest institutions on earth, the oldest communities on earth, a working organization that can respond to and deal with these new global interdependent problems? And how do we, in fact, also make democracy work? Because here's another sad fact of the nation state. We see in many parts of the world a deep cynicism about democracy. I don't mean in Iraq, I don't mean in Cairo, I don't mean in Libya, I mean in New York and London, and I don't know, maybe Moscow too. A cynicism that says democracy doesn't really work. We elect our leaders, but the leaders don't know what to do, they don't solve problems, they manipulate us. Big money, whether it's the oligarchs in Russia who have an influence on the government, or the corporations in America that buy the media and control so much of American politics, there's a sense that the nation-state democracy is not really democratic anymore in the old democracies. And in the new democracies in places like Cairo and Tripoli, people have already given up on democracy. The Arab Spring went straight to winter. No summer. No flourishing and flowering of democracy. Because in those places, too often, people said, democracy means voting, and if you vote, you have a democracy. Voting is the last thing a democracy does, not the first thing. Democracy is built bottom up, not top down. It starts in the neighborhood, in the city. It doesn't start with national elections. But in most of the places recently where new democracies have worked, we have started with elections first and citizens last. Elections without citizens, without thoughtful, educated citizens, is a recipe for totalitarianism and anarchy. And you see what has happened in some of the places where there were fast elections without citizens, without preparation, without education. Within a year or two, people decided democracy doesn't work. And one of the saddest things about the Arab Spring is that there are many countries where people have given up on democracy without ever really trying it, without knowing really what it is. And I've even met people in Poland and in Russia who say, well, the Soviet Union fell, the Soviet bloc fell. We tried democracy, but look at the results. Look what a mess politics is. It doesn't really work. It's just, instead of the rule of the party, it's the rule of money. And people then feel cynical and they walk away and say, forget democracy. So the experiment with democracy at the national level has also been a problem, which is again why I want to suggest that if we turn to the city and the kind of politics that happen in the city, you get a very different view. Downstairs, there are several exhibitions. And if you go to them, you'll see that citizens are invited to make suggestions, to complain about problems, to communicate with government. Imagine Putin or Obama or President Xi having the kind of system that they have downstairs. Come and tell me what you think I should do. Come and tell me what your issues are. You can't do it at the national level, but you can do it at the city level because cities are responsive to citizens. Mayors are your neighbors who have been elected to govern. And the result is cities work in a way that nations don't work. Cities solve problems in a way that nations don't. And one of the reasons is because mayors have to be pragmatists. They have to actually get things done. They have to make the city run. Last year, the United States of America closed the federal government twice, and they're threatening to do it again now. And nobody noticed. Because you can close the government of the United States, but you can't close New York. You can't close Moscow. You can't close Paris. You can't close a city. No fire support, no police, no schools, no hospitals, no transportation, no public facilities and utilities. It doesn't work. Cities never close, not in siege, not in war. When Moscow was under siege from Napoleon and from the Nazis, the mayor didn't say, I'm sorry, Moscow's closed. Go home. You had to keep services. You had to still pick up the garbage. You had to try to keep buses running. You had to try to keep a minimal infrastructure of public services. And that's why mayors are so pragmatic. In England and Bristol, there's a new mayor, George Ferguson. He's not a Tory or a conservative. He's not a socialist or a Labour. He's an independent. In New York, Michael Bloomberg was at first a Democrat, then a Republican, and finally he said, I'm an independent, I'm a businessman. It doesn't matter. I have to talk to private business, I have to talk to the public unions. To make New York work, I have to talk to everybody. I have to work with everybody. And national leaders don't say that. They get locked into ideology, old battles about capitalism and socialism. Whereas mayors simply get the work done. They can't get involved too much in religious ideology or political ideology. They can't talk about the isms, communism, capitalism. Instead, they have to say, I've got to make the city work. Mayor de Blasio, the new mayor of New York, is a very liberal, a progressive mayor. But within 3 weeks of being elected, there was a big snowstorm. And he did not plow the roads in part of New York. And a lot of New Yorkers said, forget it, I don't care. I agree with your politics, but if you don't keep the snow off the roads, I'm not interested. So mayors are pragmatists. They get things done. They work to make the city function. And we need political leaders to help us make the world function. And let me tell you something, because there's a lot of talk here about technology, and there's a lot of technology out there. Technology doesn't make a city function. People, citizens, public officials, and mayors make a city function. Technology is a tool. It is an instrument. Smart technology and stupid people is a disastrous combination. You don't just need smart technology, you need smart mayors, smart citizens who know how to use it. I'll give you an example. One of the great new inventions of smart cities is the parking meter that has a sensor on it. So if you're driving around looking for a spot, the parking meter says, here I am, I'm free, and it appears on your GPS map. So, oh, there's a parking space. That's called a smart technology. For me, it's a stupid technology because it encourages people to drive. It makes it easier to drive. And a smart city wants to get rid of cars and become a pedestrian zone and a bike zone. Not invite more cars to come because it's easier to park because we have a technology that helps park. Or another piece of smart technology has cameras everywhere. Cameras to give you security, cameras to recognize your face, cameras to give you the identity, cameras to look at your eyes to see who you are. And on the one hand, that's very useful. In a big data world, it provides a lot of data. It also means day and night someone is watching you. Someone knows where you are, what you are doing. Are you asleep? Are you awake? What are you eating? How are you traveling? I'm surprised a little bit here in Russia to find so much enthusiasm for a surveillance technology, since people lived here for 80 years in a surveillance state, where being watched was part of being controlled and being mastered. And a technology that allows you to be watched all the time, even when it is innocent, even when it says, I am just here to help you, can be abused and misused. So technology is only a tool, and it's only as smart as the people who are using it. If you have bad purposes and immoral purposes, smart technology is evil. I will give you a very blunt and extreme example, but it's a real example. In World War II, the Germans had a great technological innovation. They had smart death camps. Smart death camps. In the old days, to kill people, you have to kill them one by one. You shoot them, you hang them. They had a new technology of gas chambers, of chemicals, of showers that allowed you to kill thousands of people at once. That was smart technology, smart concentration camp, smart extermination camp. But of course, you wouldn't say that was really good technology, because good technology used for bad purposes is a disaster. So when people say to you, a smart city is going to be a good city and a well-governed city, ask yourself, who is determining how the technology will be used? Who is determining what the purposes of the technology are? Because that is the crucial question before we talk about what is good technology and bad technology, smart technology and stupid technology. So what we are looking for then is smart cities led by smart mayors and smart city councilors and supported by smart citizens. Then the technology will follow. Then you will get a useful and prudent technology. But here's the final dilemma I want to address. And that dilemma is that if I started by saying we had cities and then we had nation states. Why? Because the scale of the world, the scale of society, the territory grew larger and larger, and we needed a larger organization. Now we live in a global world, but my solution is to go back to cities. And you say, wait a minute, cities are small, they're local, not global. How is that going to solve the problem of global governance. Well, here's why going back to cities is a way to go forward. It's because cities are not only more democratic, more pragmatic, and more governable, they are much more cooperative, much more transactional, much more interactive with one another. 90% of the world's cities are built on water, oceans, seas, lakes, and rivers. Why? Because they are hubs of transportation, cultural exchange. Cities are unbordered. They are naturally open to one another. They work together, not apart. States have borders and guards and armies to protect themselves from other states. Cities need other cities and work together with other cities. When states grow, they grow against one another. When Germany gets larger, Poland gets smaller. But Warsaw and Berlin can both grow and flourish. It's not a zero-sum game with cities. I went last night to the Bolshoi, a dream of mine. It's one of the great, great theaters, dance companies of the world. But the great Bolshoi doesn't mean that La Scala in Milano is any less, or that the New York City Ballet is any less, or that Covent Garden is any less. In fact, having great opera houses and dance companies around the world, it's a kind of competition, but it's a competition in which everybody can get better. Everybody can raise their standards. And that's true with cities. Cities don't compete with one another by destroying one another, but by making each other stronger. I just came from Saudi Arabia, where in Jeddah they are building a new deep water port. If that port succeeds, it will be a competitor to Rotterdam, to Houston, to Los Angeles, to Rio, to other ports around the world. But it will also improve and enhance the global transportation system and make it easier to ship by container and freighter all over the world. A strong Jeddah port does not mean a weak Rotterdam port. They grow together. So unlike states where one is strong and the other is weak, cities can grow together, they can develop together, they can cooperate together. And that points to another fact about cities. Because cities are interactional, transactional, because they cooperate with one another, they are much more open, much more multicultural, much more diverse than nations. We talk of the Russian nation, the German nation, but Berlin and St. Petersburg are global, multicultural cities. In Los Angeles, 182 languages are spoken by the people who go to school there. 182, which is more or less the number of nations on earth. Cities are multicultural, nations are monocultural. So it's easy to see the German nation against the French nation. But today in Frankfurt and Marseille and Barcelona, you have, to some extent, the same population. Africans, Asians, Europeans, French, it's all mixed up. They're multicultural, and because of that, they have to be open. They have to be tolerant. They have to allow people to live together, and that makes them creative and innovative. Cities are deeply creative in their nature, not just in the sense of the Bolshoi, a great dance and opera place, but in sense of the creativity of creating new jobs, creating new inventions, creating new technologies, creating new ways of governing, like some of the ideas downstairs. So cities, creative, diverse, multicultural, open, tolerant. And then compare those qualities to the qualities of nation states. Closed, monocultural, jealous, intolerant. My government in the United States again and again has failed to develop a new immigration policy to deal with all of the people who want to come into the United States. But the mayor of New York and the mayor of Los Angeles and the mayor of Chicago say, but they're here. There are 12 million people in America who have no visa and who are illegal, undocumented. But they are there. They live there. And Mayor de Blasio says, I'm going to give them visas. I can't give them an American visa, but I'll give them a New York visa, a New York ID card. California cities have said, we have 2 million Mexican Americans living in California with no visa. They're illegal, but they drive cars, they have jobs, they go to school. So we will give them a license. Because do you want an immigrant to drive with or without a license? Because they're going to drive. They will have cars. So again, here you find cities are realists. They deal with the reality, and they deal with it in an open and tolerant way that appreciates and supports mobility, that appreciates and supports having people who can come and go and create and mix with difference. We know we live in the world today where the 5 or 10% of the population who see themselves as gay, as identifying in a different gender, where do those people go to live? Do they live on the farms? Do they live in the villages, or do they come to the big cities? And why do they come to the big cities? Because they have an open society, a tolerant society, a society that acknowledges diversity and says, that's okay. We can deal with difference. You go to a small Russian village in the backwaters, you go to a small Kansas town, you go to a small French village, you will not find people who are transgendered or people who identify openly as gay. But you go to any big city, and of course that's where they are, because that's the nature of the city, and that's what cities can offer to people. So in many different ways, then, cities have the capacity to cooperate and to look like the world we live in, to look multicultural, to look diverse, to look open, to look creative, to look interactive and transactional. And that's why I want to suggest that what we need today is to find a way to give more political power to the cities that represent all of the virtues of the modern world, all of the things we care about in democracy and tolerance and diversity. We need to empower that. And we don't have to do it at the expense of the state. We don't have to say to the state, go away, because the state has gone away all by itself. It's not working. It's not functioning. It's not solving problems. You look at the Ukraine, who wins? Merkel, Putin, the Crimea, West Ukraine, East Ukraine, nobody wins. Because you go back to the 19th century nationalist wars, subcultural wars, what is your nationality, what is your ethnic origin, and all that gets you is conflict. But you go to the cities, you go to Donetsk, you go to Kiev, you go to the cities in the region, it's a whole different story, because there it's all mixed up, the people are together. I say turn to the cities, find ways to empower the cities. And that is the origin of my project called A Global Mayor's Parliament. There are already many different intercity associations, groups of cities that are working together around climate, around transportation, around security. But there is no one global institution that represents an urban governance institution. And with many mayors in many parts of the world, we are now moving towards next autumn in England, the first convening of a global parliament of mayors. And for those who are interested, we have some materials here I can give you, but much easier, just go to the web, globalparliamentofmayors.org. One word, globalparliamentofmayors.org, and you can get a lot of information about it. But what's interesting, it is no longer a proposal or an idea. It is a project being realized. Cities will, a year from now, have met to talk about issues with one another that cities can solve whether or not states do it. Cities have to stop waiting for nations to solve problems and solve the problems themselves, because the problems of cities, sea rise, climate change, immigration, security, transportation, trade, jobs. Those are also the problems of the global world that we live in. And if cities work together, they can solve the problems for the world and for themselves at the same time. Not through argument, not through nationalism, not by drawing borders and saying you can't come in, but instead through cooperation, through interactivity, through working together to find common practices and common solutions. So I think that when we move from the state to the city, from the president to the mayor, we move from fear and despair to hope. We move from the disappointment with democracy to new anticipation for the possibilities of democracy. We move to the possibility that maybe self-government can work if you start where the people are, where the citizens are, with the city. And you heard yesterday the mayor say the most important asset in Moscow is the people, the human capital, the actual citizens. And that's true of cities everywhere. Nations never say that. When nations talk, they talk about GDP, gross domestic product. They talk about the size of their army and navy. They talk about their power grids. When mayors talk, they talk about their citizens. They talk about their people. They talk about what is the basis of all human government, the goods and needs and interests of ordinary people. So if you care about these issues, if you're despondent or unhappy with the state of democracy, if you wonder if ever Mr. Putin and Mr. Obama and Mr. Xi and Ms. Merkel will ever agree on anything, then stop watching television. Stop watching the daily news and start looking at what's happening in your own cities and how what you do in the cities is happening in every other city around the world where half the population lives or more. And start asking yourself, how can I cooperate with citizens in other cities? How can my mayor talk to Mayor de Blasio of New York and Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles and Mayor Paes of Rio and Mayor Trias of Barcelona? And how together can they meet and solve the problems that states have shown themselves in this new interdependent world incapable of solving? With the Parliament of Mayors, with the focus on cities and citizens, comes new hope for democracy, new hope for governance, and new hope for the solutions of the global challenges that an interdependent world forces us to face. Because if we do not solve global problems, if we do not create sustainable cities and a sustainable world, then we will not have a world to sustain. We will not have a future for our children. A long time ago, an American said, American democracy is the last best hope. That's never been true. It's always a hope for many people. America has no monopoly on democracy. Far from it. But the last best hope today is the hope of citizens around the world living in cities and cooperating with other cities and saying, we will fix the problems the nations don't fix. If the nations make war, we will make peace. If the corporations make inequality, we will make justice. If the carbon industry creates a world of inclement and extreme weather and rising oceans, we will make a sustainable world. And the great thing about that is you don't have to wait for your mayor to do it. That project starts with you as citizens. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions and comments. Thank you. Oh, this is set up. Thank you very much. By the way, this is my associate, our executive director, who has a lot of materials. If you're looking for some materials, come to see her, and she will be able to help you do that.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you for the great lecture, really inspiring. What about states in classical in a classical problem that states solve. I mean, if we're talking about immigration, mayors much more about consequences of decisions that states make, and also about, for example, economics. States make redistribution between regions of money, all that stuff. So how can it be done in, for example, 100 years from now? How can cities talk to each other and solve that problem that now solved by governments?
Well, two answers. The short answer is they need more institutions to cooperate in, and the Global Parliament of Mayors is a first example of a place where mayors from around the world can come and face those common challenges. But here's how they do it when there are still nation states there. When cities deal with immigration, Hamburg cannot give a German or a Schengen visa to an immigrant from Africa. And the United States, New York cannot give a visa, an American visa, to an immigrant. But if Hamburg gives a Hamburg visa and New York gives a New York visa, that can become a road to citizenship. Because the nation states are desperate. They want to deal with these problems, but they don't know how to do it. And the cities are showing the way. So, for example, I can imagine the United States of America saying at some point, if immigrants can get a local visa from New York or Chicago or Miami, that will be a road to American citizenship. And I can imagine German government saying, if you get a visa for Frankfurt or Munich or Berlin, that will be a road to a German or even a European visa. In other words, nation states are not solving problems, and if cities can do it, nation states for the most part will say, yes, we will work with you, let's make it happen. So I think nation states will not be an obstacle. The obstacle is they're not doing anything. They can't agree. But if cities can agree, I think in many cases on many issues, nation states will go along. And so 100 years from now, you will have a world of cities. There will still be states, but the states will follow the cities and not try to lead them.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question in Russian. Could you please hear?
I have one question. You are talking about cities against nation states. 1, 2, can you hear me? You always do a certain comparison between cities and nation states, as it was cities against nation states. But between cities and nations, we have another institutions. In Russian Federation, we have subjects of federation, okrugs, republics, and so on, so forth. In the United States, we're talking about states like Texas and so on and so forth. This is an intermediate level. What should we do with that? What kind of cooperation?
Question, and a very important question, because you are right. There's actually 4 levels. There's the city, there's the province or the state or the Land or the canton, whatever you call it. There's the nation, and of course there are regional organizations like the European Union, even at a higher level. So you're right to say that there are many different ones. I would argue historically, though, the 2 primary ones are the city and the state. In federal republics like Mexico, Canada, India, the United States, Russia, Germany, and many others, you're right, there are 3 levels. And I think you'll find it's quite different. In some places, the states work closely with the cities and are rivals of the nation. In others, like Germany, the Land is very close to the federal government, and the cities have a problem with the Länder as well as with the Federal Republic. But you're right to say we have to factor that in. But my central argument is this. The level of Brussels in Europe, the level of France or England or Russia, the level of the local state or Land or canton are all levels of government. The city is not a level of government. The city is the essential community where we live, and it should be privileged. It should have a special status with respect to all those others. And you're right to say we need to make it work in different ways in different places. But my argument is not that the others will go away, but that the cities need more power, more resources, more jurisdiction to do the things that they are being asked to do, and more importantly, the things they have shown they are capable of doing. There's an English word, I'm sure it's in Russian, we have a wonderful translator in the back who can help with this. The word is unfunded mandate. Unfunded mandate. That's when the federal government, that's when Russia says to Moscow, you must do this and this and this. And then the mayor of Moscow says, thank you, do I have rubles to pay for? He said, that's your problem. You have an obligation, but you have no resources. The unfunded mandate is a central problem. The cities of the world produce 80% of the wealth of the world. And you know how much they get back after they pay taxes and provide for the Russian Navy and the Russian economy and the Russian agriculture? They get back less than half of what they give to solve their own problems. So my argument is that the cities need more of those resources. The Länder get the resources, the higher levels get the resources, they tax the cities. The cities produce the wealth, they need to keep more of the wealth, they need more authority to spend the wealth. So it's a very good question, and we have to look in each country. As you say, it's a little different. Some are federal, some are unitary, some have a lot of power at the intermediate level, some don't have so much, and those are important questions. But they don't change my basic argument, which is that the city is the most important, the most essential. It needs more power, more resources, more money to do the things that cities alone can do.
All right. I'd like to ask you about agglomerations. Yes. Probably they should unite in something like Greek polis, I think. What can you say about agglomerations? Yes.
The way I would rephrase your question is, when we say the city, what do we mean? Do we need Moscow inside the old walls? Do we mean Moscow in terms of Moscow as it was defined 75 years ago? Or do we mean Moscow and all the suburbs around it? Or do we mean Moscow and some of the agricultural zones around it that provide some of the food and the water for Moscow? Generally, what your question, I think, to me suggests is that we live in a world of old cities that are defined very narrowly, but the reality is agglomerations, is metro regions, is a way to, if you'd like to listen to my answer, I know the gentleman wants to talk to you, but I'm trying to answer his question, and if you're talking in his ear, he won't hear the answer. Thank you. The real regions we need to talk about are metro regions, not just cities. And Matteo Renzi, who is the Prime Minister of Italy, who's heard of Matteo Renzi, Prime Minister of Italy? He was the mayor of Florence a year ago. And he became Prime Minister, and he said, we cannot govern Italy by the old provinces, nor can we govern Italy by cities, by Genoa and Torino and Milano. They're too narrow. We need to reorganize Italy into 9 urban metro regions. And he has now created a new Italian constitution. And Italy is 9 agglomerations, 9 metro regions, and that's a much better way to do it. I'll tell you a story. Everyone know Detroit? When you think of Detroit, what do you think about? A failed city, right? Bankruptcy, terrible. And it's true, if you look at Detroit, 50 years ago, Detroit had 2 million people. It was the 4th largest city in the United States. Today it has 600,000 people. It's lost two-thirds of its population. It used to have all the car industry, now it has nothing. The schools are closed, the parks are closed. So you might say Detroit is a disaster. But there are 10 counties around Detroit, which are the greater Detroit metro region. Those counties have gone from 3 million people to 5 million people. Those counties have 80% of the auto industry that used to be in downtown Detroit. They're out there in the counties. Now, if we define the city of Detroit as the Detroit metro region, Detroit would not be bankrupt. It would be one of the most successful cities in America, but with a little problem, a ghetto problem in what was the old city. So this is what's important about your question. If we define a city narrowly, it's not sustainable. It can't have the resources. It doesn't have the jurisdiction. But if we define it in terms of the metro region that will even include some of the agriculture around that provides food and the water table that provides the water, then we have a much better understanding of what a city really is, which is the center of a region. And really, if I were to rename my book, I would not say if cities ruled the world, I would say if metro regions could rule the world. So thank you for that question, because it points to the need to enlarge our definition. In Europe, many of our cities still have medieval definition with the old walls, very narrow. But new cities are much more extensive, and we need to redefine their jurisdiction and authority in those terms.
Good afternoon. What do you think about local currencies, like Bristol Pound, for example? Do you think they can help to solve the problems which you talked about today? Thank you.
Well, thank you, and that's a great, I don't know how many of you know, but many places, in one of the places where I live, in the Berkshire, in Western Massachusetts, they actually develop a local currency to try to empower the local economy and give a sense that in the locality, you can have an economic commerce that works. I like it and I hate it. And I'll tell you why. I'm both. I like it because it helps show that a regional economy, a local economy, can have its own integrity, its own unity, its own currency. It encourages local economics. But we live in an interdependent global world. And the problem comes with local economies is how do they interact with the national economy and the global economy? And of course, the local currencies can't really do that. So the danger is that a local currency empowers a city in a marginal way, but actually insulates it from the interdependent trade and the interdependent economy of a global world. So maybe the best thing is when you have a local currency next to a national or even a global currency. So you have some empowerment. That's what happens in my part. People can use Berkshire shares, as they're called, Berkshires, and they can use others as well. But it's a great question because it points to the possibilities of innovation at the local level. And I would never want just to criticize it, because I think it's a very innovative and thoughtful idea that needs to be explored, but we need to figure out how local currencies integrate into a global economy.
Thank you for your speech. Actually, I wanted to ask how the Global Parliament of Mayors is working. For example, is this the summit, and then you provide the output for the cities or for the mayors? So how it works, and how do you then scale your things and works?
Thank you. That's a great question. And in my next hour, I'll answer the question. Two things. First of all, that is a question we have to ask the mayors themselves, because next October in London and Bristol will be the first real meeting. And many of the questions around this room, the question about agglomerations, the question about local currency, these are questions the mayors have to answer. We're helping to create it, but the mayors and cities will run it themselves. But the plan right now is for about 120 cities who will volunteer to come or we will invite to come. But in future years, the mayors themselves will have to figure out. I mean, here's a problem. Do you know how many cities over 50,000 there are in the world? 250,000. Now, how do you have a parliament that represents 250,000 cities? But on the other hand, most states have a Congress that represents millions and tens of millions and even hundreds of millions of people. So representation, we have to have a representation system where some cities represent others. The second thing is an opt-in. If you have a global parliament that says, we will do this new policy on transportation, other cities that are not there can say, we will opt in, we will agree, we will do that, we will approve that, even if they didn't help to make it. The third and most important thing, we talked about technology, smart technology. We want a digital or virtual platform for the mayors. The most difficult thing we have when we say to mayors, will you come to London? Will you come to Dubai? Will you come to Moscow for a meeting of mayors? They say, I'm busy running my city, and you want me 2 or 3 times a year to travel somewhere for 2 days? I can't do that. So we have said to them, we will work with Google or Cisco or IBM or another company to develop a virtual platform. So the mayor will sit in his office with a screen like that one, and on that screen he will see 300 or 400 other mayors. We'll talk to them, we'll deliberate, they'll take decisions together, and then maybe once every other year they will meet together, because you all know from Facebook and so on, if you have friends you never met, it's very different than if you have a friend who you love and know, and then you have some Facebook. And mayors are like that. They have to know each other first, then they can meet virtually. But so representation and a virtual platform that allows mayors, many more cities than just the several hundred who meet will do it. But all of this, I have to emphasize, is an experiment. The first sitting will be next fall. We've held 3 planning meetings, but not the parliament. So the first parliament will be next fall, and the mayors who meet will have to answer these questions, these very good questions you've asked. They will have to say, how do we represent it? How do we deal with regions? How do we deal with states and Länder and the intermediate that you pointed to? That will be a question we have to put to the mayors. And they will have to answer this question, because the mayors, the city's parliament, will belong to mayors and their citizens. So that is the absolutely crucial thing. And is there another question? I think we have to, they say we have to. Let me end with this simple, I want to end with something that Russians will appreciate, a point of etymology, the history of language. The word city and the word citizen have the same root, cité, citoyen in French. When we talk about cities, one of the reasons I love to talk about cities is that we're talking about citizens. State, état, we're talking about rulers. With cities, we're talking about citizens. And mayors are neighbors and citizens who are taking a turn to help govern. So cities are not just about government and them, cities are about us. And that's one of their great strengths. Thank you very much.